I'd like to speak about language, literature, and the emergence of Sufi culture in colonial Sindh. And through this paper, I think to understand the process through which a new culture based on Sufism was produced in colonial Sindh. Sufi poetry was quickly identified by the British as the best sample of Sindhi literature, and since the British needed books for learning Sindhi, the first excerpts of Sufi poetry were published. It was thus obvious that the colonial power had not any interest in Sufism per se. Some officials were nevertheless convinced by the necessity of publishing a text which was, according to them, to the British officer who knew Sindhi, the quintessence of Sindh. It meant that the knowledge of this text, the Shajuri Salo, would allow the Europeans to understand the people of Sindh and their traditions and customs. Briefly put, publishing the Risalo would provide a powerful tool to control the Sindhi society. So this paper will deal with what I call textual anthropology, because after the first printing of the Shajuri Salo, it is very important to see that a new elite of Sindhi intellectuals, literati, were also very interesting by publishing Sufi text. And through textual anthropology, I'd like to speak about why did they select such text, what was the literary genre which was interesting for them, and what does the selection of this text teach us about the Sindhi society at the turning point of the 19th and the 20th century. So there is also the issue of text circulation between the British and this new elite of Sindhi literati. It all started when in 1851, so about Alfred, the chief commissariat Sindh, decided that it was compulsory for the British officer to learn what they call colloquial Sindhi. And of course, first, they decided to select a dialect of Sindhi as a standard Sindhi and also a script, and then to publish books for this British officer to learn the Sindhi, the colloquial Sindhi. And very soon in 1853, the first lithographic book in Sindhi was published, and it was only the first one in the program that Frere had launched when he was chief commissioner in Sindh. Also, another gentleman played a very important role. He was not British, he was German. His name was Ernst Tromp, because he was the one who published also one of the first Sindhi reading book, also for this British officer to learn Sindhi. But it's very interesting to see that in the preface of the Sindhi reading book, he explained why he published it. It was especially for the missions, not only for the British officer, but also for the Christian missions. And so in this book, he put a number of texts in Sindhi, first translation from the Bible, but also a story of Udarolal, and also 2 chapters of Shajuri Salo, namely Sur Surat and also Sur Saswe. So it was maybe the first time in 1858 that some pieces of the Shajuri Salo were printed. After this first book, Trump also decided to translate some chapters of the Shajuri Salo, especially Sur Surat. It was translated into German and published in 1863 in a German academic journal. But his most important achievement was in 1866, the edition of a printed version of the Shajuri Salo in Leipzig in Germany. So it was the first time, according to my knowledge, that this Shajuri Salo was printed, and also that a Sufi text in Sindhi was printed. It is well known that this first edition was not very successful among the Sindhi literati. And so that very soon after this first edition, we can see that new edition of the Shajuri Salo, which different chapter, different shapes, also different order in the exposition of the chapter could be found. And after this first publication, still the British were not very interested in Sufism per se yet in the second part of the 19th century. But interestingly, in Sindh, we can see the emergence of a new elite. So what do I call new elite? I mean, they were not belonging to traditional elites, such as specialists in religion, either Islam or Hinduism, people like ulama or pandit, or other traditional elite like Sajjada Nashin or big zamindar. Excuse me, I'm lost here. And yeah, this new elite were gentlemen who usually were educated in English medium schools, and later on they used to join the British administration. They were a judge or tax collector or even teacher. And in the last quarter of the 19th century, this new elite took interest into Sufism. But as you have seen in my title, I don't use the word Sufism, I use the word Sufi culture, because it is very interesting to see how they did represent Sufism. As I put before, they were not specialists of Sufism. They were working in the administration, but they were the main actor in the publication of Sufi text. And in a first phase also, we can see that this literati finally found that the Shajjali Salo was not very easy. And to some extent, it can be surprising that the British decided to publish it for learning Sindhi, because it is true that it is not the easiest text when you want to learn Sindhi. So in the last quarter of the 19th century, some books were published, some in English by gentlemen, and other in Sindhi. For example, in the 1890s, we have two gentlemen who published these books for explaining the difficult words used by Shah Latif, the different allegories, and also what they call sometimes, they want to say that the text of the Shajjali Salo, I quote of course, is archaic, used abbreviated forms of words, and deal in mystical ideas. So for them it was obviously a difficult text, and even when this text was also chosen by the University of Bombay, it was necessary for the student to add a glossary also for explaining the same words and so on. Among this new literati, we can also mention a very important intellectual named Mirza Khalid Bek. Of course, everybody has heard about him. So he was among the first scholar to take a new perspective. No, it's not this one. Yeah, a new perspective, because finally, since in the first phase, this literati focus on the Sufi poetry, and especially on the divan, and I have no time to explain why finally they decided that the best representation of Sufism was poetry, especially what they call the divan, and especially the Kafi genre. But finally also, they soon shifted to another perspective, another approach of Sufism. It is the approach through the biographies of the Sufi saints. Of course, it was not really a new genre, because to some extent, there is in Islamic Sufism a very well-known genre which is called Tazkira, and it comes from the word zikr, so it is a way for remembering the saints. But from this Tazkira, and it is to be mentioned that in Sindh it was not well spread as a genre if we compare with Iran and with other parts of India. But this new elite, this new literati of Sindh, they knew about the Tazkira, and finally they wanted to take this model, but also to transform it and to adapt the knowledge of Sufism to their own way of life. And among these scholars, Once again, there is Mirza Khalid Beg, because he was maybe, according to my knowledge, the first to publish a book on the life of Shah Latif. It was published in the 1880 about. And then later on, other books were published on different Sufi, not only of Sufi of Sindh, one on Bayazid Bistami, another one of Mansour Halaj in the beginning of the 20th century. So it's interesting to see this shifting from the Sufi poetry to the life, and not exactly the Tazkira, what more and more was to be named Hayat. So we can think about biography. But it is true also that it was a major trend among the South Asian Muslim, because in the middle of the 19th century, such scholar like Said Ahmad Khan and also Said Amir Ali started to work on biography of sacred figures of Islam. So we can think that this Sindhi literature were also located in the wake of this general evolution in South Asia. Also, regarding Mirza Khalid Beg, it's very important that he also published a book to explain the language used in the Shah Salo, and he published a number of books on Sufism, among numerous books, because as you know, I think that he finally published hundreds of books about different topics, and of course Sufism was a topic among many others. But regarding Sufism, it is also to be precise that with other Sindhi intellectuals, and now we are at the beginning of the 20th century, a new representation of Sufism was born, because we can think that there was also some interaction between this intellectual and other. And beside Mirza Khalid Beg, we can also mention another Sindhi scholar, Fateh Mohammed Sevani, who was born in Sevan, of course, in 1882. And he did also some work regarding the Sufi. And it is also to be noted that he wrote one of the first history of Sindhi literature, but which was published many years after he passed away in the 1950 for the first time. But regarding Sufism, Fateh Mohammed Sevani was the author of a book devoted to Lal Shahbaz Qalandar since he was born in Sewan. It was published for the first time in 1904. And what is very interesting, it is that in the first edition, there is the word Tazkira, which is used. But in the following edition, this word Tazkira disappears. And also, if you have a look at the content of the book, it is named Kalandar Namo Sindhi. It is not anymore a traditional Tazkira, because you can find many aspects, many information which are not really included usually in this Tazkira. For example, Sevani gave some depiction of the rituals which are performed in Sevan, but it's also interesting to see the vocabulary used, because as you know, the main dance which is performed in Sevan is known as Damal, but you cannot find this word in Fateh Mohammed Sevani. And on the other side, we know that this word was already used, because it is used in some other Sufi poets, like, for example, Bedil. He used the word Damal when he referred to this Sevani dance. So, to some extent, we can say that Sevani were in a halfway between this Tazkira and a new literary genre, when he wanted to speak about the Sufi himself, but also about all the social life which was around this Sufi scene. And in this book, he was also cautious. Maybe it is an explanation about why he didn't use the word Damal, because he preferred to use the more classic term of Naubat, which is from Arabic origin. So now I'd like to add a few words about some other literati, and especially this Mirza Khalid Beg, because according to my reading, I think that there was another spiritual society which were very important in all this development, and this society is the Theosophical Society. And as you know, it was created in 1895 in Karachi, and also Annie Besant, at the time she was the head of the society, of the Theosophical Society. She went to Karachi just before the creation of this branch in Karachi. And it's very interesting because we can see that most of this elite, of this literati at the beginning of the 20th century were a member of the Theosophical Society. And as you know, this society was created by Helen Blavatsky, and they wanted to create a kind of ideal, a universal brotherhood through not a new religion, but a new spirituality which could include all the religions, of the religious messages. But it is true that Blavatsky and also Annie Besant were mainly influenced by Hindu spirituality. So Mirza Khalid Beg himself was member of the Theosophical Society, and we can find maybe in his understanding of Sufism, representation of Sufism, some connection with it. But also he was dealing with the notion, concept drawn up by Akbar and knows as Sulikul. So for him, he gave different interpretation of this Sufi culture. And I just want to end with another Sindhi literature, very important, Jetmal Parsram, same. He was born in 1886. He was a journalist, and also he was not only interested by Sufism, because he also produced a lot of books, but his representation was to some extent in the wake of Mirza Khalid Beg's one, because he was from a younger generation. So Jetmal Parsram, for example, published a book on Shalatif, another one on Sachal Sarmast, and also with another gentleman, Nilaram Premchand, he published this Sufi Sagora. Maybe it is the first attempt also to link the Sufi of Sindh with Sufi from Middle East, because in this book there is a chapter on Shalatif, another one on Jalaluddin Rumi, and other. But maybe his most interesting book was this one he published in English, and as you can see, I'm sorry, we cannot see the title, but it's very famous. His name is Sindh, and it's Sufi. And it was published in 1924 by the Theosophical Publishing House in Madras, where were the headquarters of the society. So in his book himself, he put that to some extent we can say that Sufism is a theosophy. And also, of course, for him, there is no difference except in the field of terminology between Sufism and the Vedanta. So it was very briefly put, and I'm sorry for that, to see how a new understanding of Sufism was spread in Sindh at a turning point on this 20th century by this new elite. And also it is to say, in continuity with the talk of Matt Cook, that a category of Sindhi literati, the Amil, play an important role, because a number of them, and for example, the first books which are published on the Shajoli Salo, to give some explanation about the text, were published by people from this community of the Amil. Thank you very much.